So thank you, Dr. Vishal Gupta, for this kind introduction. I'm honored to be here to share my thoughts about rewards, resources, and work-life balance. I'm honored to be at IIM Ahmedabad, and I am happy to be with people here and people through streaming wherever you are. Welcome to this session. I think the structure is that I would speak for about 40 minutes. And then if you have any questions, you can ask questions and I would respond to those. So be patient with the process. And what I'm planning to do is to basically share my journey, so to speak, as my thinking evolved about certain issues. So to give you a sense of it, I'm going to begin with this broader framework of how I have evolved over time. So I began my research process in incentive systems, financial incentives. And then I continue to work in different aspects of incentive systems, including skill-based pay. And currently I'm working with Professor Jason Shaw and about 70 more researchers on a large-scale global pay project that has foundations in some of the earlier thoughts we have explored. So this global pay project basically has, so we have been collecting data from companies in about 33 countries. So as we gathered information about it, I started to look at resources as a broader issue than just pay system. And I started working on some of the resource gaps, and particularly gender resource gaps, because I do believe that as labor force has become more men and women both taking part in it, that we need to look at whether men and women have equal opportunities in so many ways. So equality in resources or resource gap. So that's where the idea of resources kind of started to fit into it. Then about 5 years back, I also started looking at work-life balance, something that matters to both men and women, as we would say. And pandemic has only hastened the pace of that issue to some extent. And I think many of you would wonder how work-life balance would change with hybrid work system, a question that I think many of us are asking right now, researchers or managers. So I'll touch upon some of the challenges we face on that. So work-life balance, gender resource gap, and pay system broadly come together for me in these three areas. Now, I do list another side of it. Soft skills, I think, is a very popular topic. And you would be surprised to actually, I was surprised, if not you are surprised, to find that people talk about soft skills, but nobody knows what they are and how to measure them or even pay for them. So soft skill is a project that I have not dug deep into, but something that ultimately goes back to skill-based pay related idea. So when I started looking into it, I found out that soft skills as a resource or as a component that we can pay, there is not much out there. There's probably no research done in that area. And we looked at quite a bit and we could not find good research in this area. So popular topic, but lacks scholarship. So that's where I listed that. I have a few more areas, but these are 4 broad areas that I'm continuing to work with. So that's where I'm going to talk about. But just to start with culmination of different thought process, we started with basic idea of expectancy theory and incentive and evolved our thinking. That's what we call as science of reward system or scientific basis of reward system. I'm going to list 6 facts that we believe can be supported by evidence. So that's my first part, that I'm going to talk about performance-based pay and how science can support it. So in US, it is almost universally used. About 95% corporations claim to use performance-based pay. Other countries are moving towards it, including China, Japan, Hong Kong, Finland are moving towards it. So performance-based pay is popular or becoming popular. It's valuable. It's supposed to be equitable and so forth. And I have been working with this area forever. So should be right. or it should be supported, but surprisingly not as much information or scientific evidence is available for us. So there is a lot of heated debate. Is it good? Is it bad? So for example, in public schools, there is this thing like whether pay can actually hurt teachers and learning and so forth. Daniel Pink has this very popular TED talk, The Puzzle of Motivation. If you have not watched it, you should. 27 million people have. We disagree with it. It's a very popular topic. It tells you that extrinsic rewards are bad. And I will explain that that may not be the case. But again, controversial too. So pay for performance is not just important, but controversial. So what do we know? We know that there's a positive relationship between incentives and job performance. How much? Well, our first analysis, which is a highly cited work on financial incentive, tells us that financial incentives and job performance has a correlation of 0.34. Now, those who care about numbers would know that any correlation above 0.3 is considered good. Not great, but good. And in social sciences, anything above 0.5 is nearly impossible. Under control setting, this study found out the relationship close to about 0.6 under control setting. Of course, world is not control setting. So 0.34 is what we would take. Now, 0.34 is not a bad number for quantity. So we know that it works in real world. Now, what about fact number 2? Now, this is a controversial area, and I think some of scholars would disagree with this, but evidence seems to suggest that at least it does not hurt, that financial incentives do not erode intrinsic motivation. So the fear is that money can hurt intrinsic motivation. If you give money to people, they would not be motivated by job itself or intrinsic aspect of job itself. We looked at several studies. Turns out that the correlation is 0.3 or above even for intrinsic motivation or creativity. Again, is not supported, as Mr. Pink says, it's not really supported that incentives hurt intrinsic motivation. Why not? Well, the thing is, the broader logic is that it is either this or that. Now, how many of us would say, give me money or give me intrinsic job? How many of you would want money and intrinsic job? Answer is all of us do. In fact, chances are that those who talk about intrinsic motivation would not refuse money for their talk. So it is both people want. Another way of looking at this is that most exciting jobs are higher level jobs. Jobs at the lower level are not really that exciting, right? Well, where is the most money? At the higher level jobs. So the idea that somehow money is bad for intrinsic jobs is not supported by evidence. That intrinsic motivation may still exist, or money may not at least hurt it. So we think it's unnecessary controversy that we need to look at more comprehensively. Number 3. Now, this is something that we are trying to learn more about, is based on psychophysics of pay. Typically, we think as we give more money, there would be more effort. The correlation is what it is, like linear relationship. Now, psychophysics says that's not the case. That in fact, if the salary or the incentive is below a certain percent, what kind of reaction there could be? Or if it is above a certain level, what kind of reaction there could be? Is it linear or more like a step function? So what we find is that there might not be a whole lot of activity if the rewards are less than 5%. In other words, people may say, yeah, I got it, may type thing. But if it is more than 10%, it may not make as much difference. So below 5%, it doesn't excite workers. Above 10%, returns are not strong enough. So somewhere between 5 to 10% is where your sweet spot is. So in other words, our mind tells us that workers are more likely to be excited by money somewhere in the range of 5 to 10%. This is the pay raise threshold range. Okay. That's how our brain works. Now you might say, what about inflation? Now this is a controlled study, which means these results are not affected by inflation. Now, how many corporations have 5% plus inflation for incentives? Probably not many, particularly when it becomes part of your salary. Bonuses might be an answer to this. So what we suggest is that if you have bonuses, that's what you use instead of pay for performance logic there. But if you have anything less than 5%, you may not get the results that you want. So think about it. If you don't have budget, money may not be your answer. What Lawler says, money is not a piker's game. It is not for people who are stingy. Money is not a piker's game. Number 4. Now, up until our recent study, we found out that most of the idea was, how do you connect rewards to expectations? But if you think about stock market and how stocks behave with this, was there any surprise in earning? So we manage corporate earning by creating surprises, and then stock price goes up. Same is also true for workers too. That there are 2 sides to it, actually 3. Are you underpaying, undermeeting, meeting, or exceeding the expectations? So the one thing is, what if you exceed what they were expecting? The other thing is, what if you did not exceed? Chances are you're not likely to exceed because most people think they deserve more. But in any case, expectations play a role. But we also found out that control in their mind, whether they control the factors to influence their incentives. So you need to combine 2. So when you do not have any control, okay, as a worker, if you do not have any control and you get more money, what is your reaction? But if you do not have any control, if you get less money, what do you feel? So if you have no control, you get more money, it's like, wow, lottery, lucky, right? You're not in control. So you feel like it's a lottery that you got. But if you get less, then you say, whatever, because you are not in control. So you say, no big deal. So when surprise is for underpayment or overpayment under no control, things are random for people. But if they are in control, that's where the problem is. So if your pay system is good, which is people know what they need to do to earn money, then you are in more trouble because you are telling people what to do and then you did not do as a manager. In this case, if people get more than what they got, they say, well, I knew. That's what I would have gotten. No big deal. But notice here, what happens if you pay them less than what they expect? They are angry. They're disgusted. They're likely to leave. That's where corporations would be in bigger trouble. They design a good system and do not meet expectations. So what's the answer here? Make sure that expectations are clearly stated. Make sure the system is clear and make sure to meet expectations. That's what so it's just 4 boxes, yeah. Y-axis is basically surprise versus reaction. So why not just go with lottery system? Because sometimes you say pay systems are not in your control. Well, the answer is the 5th reason, which is procedural justice. Now, many of us talk about distributive justice or equitable pay, but research seems to suggest that procedural justice is even more important. That it is not what people get paid, it is the method to get paid that becomes more critical, particularly if you undermeet the expectations. So be consistent, be unbiased, and use accurate information. in which case, in case you do not meet their expectation, they would be less angry. So we believe that focus on justice perceptions rather than distributive perceptions is more critical. Finally, of course, pay systems work in their context and the culture, that they should fit with strategy. So if innovation is your strategy, maybe use skill-based pay. If operational excellence is your strategy, use PFP, and context, culture, and so forth. So let me summarize all this for you, that pay for performance is a powerful tool. In fact, it's so powerful that it will get you what you want. So most researchers who study incentives will tell you that it's so powerful that you have to be careful as to how you use it. That's why these facts I'm stating. Do not worry about intrinsic versus extrinsic, rather than combine the two. Roughly 5 to 7% is the range you should target. If you cannot use it in the form of PFP, use bonus system. You should target incentives to meet expectations. Make sure you're procedurally consistent, accurate, and unbiased. And finally, use pay systems that are fitting the system with your HR, with your strategy, with your culture. A good example of that, I think you might have heard about, is that famous case study in Harvard, where a company in USA went to Malaysia and tried to use incentive system and failed because culture was different. So any corporation that wants to use it, make sure it fits with the national culture, with company culture and values and so forth. Otherwise it will fail. So that was the starting point. But then as we started looking more into other things, one of the things that I started thinking about is work-life balance. And actually this came out in Economic Times recently, I think a couple of days back, where one of the issues we deal with is time. It's like if you have time, why not even respond 24/7? So what work-life balance? Work-life balance is an issue that is important for all of us. But before I get into it, I think it's important to briefly talk about resources, because resources are why people do what they do, money included. So some of the ideas we took was from conservation of resources theory by Hubwall, who defines resources that are 4 types: objects like house and car and so forth, personal characteristics like self-efficacy, optimism, and so things like that, conditions like marriage. If you have good marriage versus bad marriage, of course, good marriage is good thing, a bad marriage is bad thing, or energies, which is like effort or physical energy. There is a measurement where they look at 70 such resources. You can classify them in limited categories. The basic idea of conservation of resources theory is this, that people attempt to gain resources and protect them. Why? Because it helps them insulate from negative things like stress and strain. Stress and strain results from loss of resources, or even the threat of loss of resources. Loss of resources are often experienced more strongly than gain of resources. I think all of us know that when you get 5% raise, that is okay. But if your pay is cut by 5%, you're ready to kill somebody. Your reaction is much stronger to loss. And that's the idea here, that any loss creates more stress than any gain. It doesn't give you enough buffer. Finally, I think resources create resources. Also, resource loss creates resource loss. That's the cycle. So people with money, for example, can afford time. Keep that in mind. And keep also in mind that work-life balance has always been thought of more like a conflict, a trade-off, that if you are working, then you don't have time at home. It's a trade-off, it's a conflict. Limited resources, time, effort, commitment. If you use it here, then you cannot use it there. But that logic really doesn't account for resources. In a way, it does not, because it considers as if there is resource in both places at the same time. But the fact is that we go to work for different reasons than go to family for different reasons. There is no trade-off sometimes. So instead of looking at conflict, we need to look at why do people engage in different domains of life. And that's where we would go with this logic today. I also want to highlight this part because of pandemic and other reasons, that there is a larger resource gap. Then those people have less resources, that creates anxiety and scorn and all sorts of other psychological processes in social settings that could harm people who are experiencing the gap. And I say this because at least in the US and possibly all over the world, at least data that I have looked at, I've just begun to collect global data on this, seem to suggest that the gender resource gap is a global phenomenon, not just US thing. So almost no country is sparing this part. And I think in that sense, surprisingly, women are actually catching up to all sorts of things associated with stress issues. But I'll share something interesting with regard to work-life balance and cultural issues in countries like India. One last slide before I talk about work-life balance is this classification of resources, as explained by two authors here, that there are some personal resources that are key, like self-esteem, self-efficacy, optimism, and social power status. These are key resources because they are stable for you. You always have them. So for example, leadership. Leaders who experience problem in work setting, if they have high self-esteem and self-efficacy, can deal with that and buffer themselves from any stress or strain. Also, at personal level, you would notice that there are constructive resources like what we call as human capital or health. So people with poor health often tend to have problems. Down there are more temporary resources like effort, moods, and emotions. Those are temporary resources. You may or may not always have them. On this side are contextual resources. So for example, contextual, somewhat limited, could be love and support. You may not always have them. There might be some argument in the relationships and so forth. On the upper side, permanent side, work opportunities, wage and benefits are more permanent, and likewise, wealth is more permanent, and marriage could be permanent. Okay, so let's begin with, keep this in mind, resources, and now issue of why do people engage in different domains of life. So in United States, roughly 61% of families have at least with one child. They work as couples, dual earning couples. That means both of them are working, means they might experience work-life balance issues. What about India? I could not find a lot of data other than this 2014 article that says that in urban settings, 50% of 51% of household had single earners, but 26%, which is still a very large number, have dual earners. A large number of dual earners or single parents, if you're a single parent, that's more common in certain cultures, you're more likely to experience work-life balance issues or stress related to that. Hybrid is another thing that is emerging. This story was again in Economic Times on April 16th. The title is "Only Way to Get Women Back to Office, Do Not Try." Now, when I looked at this title, I said, wow, I can use this. Then I looked at this title second time, I said, wow, there is a problem here. So let me look at it at two levels. First, what they reported, the reality. 90% of survey participants said they would prefer remote work. This is India. A majority of would take pay cut for flexible workplace. I think that would be true in any country these days. But that's the data in India. More than 60% would leave if employer enforces return to office. Only 8% wanted to go back in person. That's surprising numbers, right? You think it's true? But that's what they found. Roughly 6,200 participants from mid-sized companies, probably a representative sample. But let's look at the second part, which they did not say, but I'm making it up. I look at it and say, why not they say that about men? Why not say only way to get men to work, don't try? Why not? Because that's the gender bias. Now, I'm not saying this is India. This is a problem world over. I can give you many examples from Japan, America, and so forth. Like, for example, I think there was a recent ad in America that had this thing where a woman goes to shop for a car and nobody's talking to her. And then a robot comes and says, her husband is about to come, and they talk to the robot. So there's a gender bias all over the world with regard to hybrid situation. But why do we even say that women want this? I'll confess, my wife works from home and she thinks it's a good idea. Her coworker is our pet, Harley, for 2 years. She was my dog, not anymore. She is a collaborator, happy coworker with my wife. I have lost my pet to remote work. I'm joking, but fact is that she's working from home and she's okay with it, partly because she doesn't have to travel and she still thinks her role is to take care of things at home. A biased view of the world. How does that affect women more than men? Something that we do not know yet. If that's going to be the case, if 90% of workers would stay home wherever they can, women can, how does that impact their work-life balance issue? If there is no work and life separation, there are all sorts of, I think, magazines that tell you how to separate yourself. When you go to work, create an office and so forth. So to create those two separate things, create boundaries. But there are issues that we do not know yet. So traditionally, work-life balance has been employed as without caring for what exactly it means. So we have argued, and I think Casper, another scholar, argues that work is also life. So why use term work-life balance as if work is not life? In fact, if you look at hours spent, pretty much all waking hours are spent at the workplace. That is your life for many of us, right? For many of us. So why not call it work, non-work balance? Although I'm going to use term work-life balance, keep in mind that term itself is biased in some ways. It seems to suggest as if work is something bad and you go there, work, and then come back to life, real life. Okay, that's problematic in my mind because it implies as if work is a bad thing. The second thing is balance. Balance, what does it mean? Trade-off or something else? And I'm going to argue that trade-off is not the right way to look at it, but more like balance across multiple life domains. World Value Surveys identify 6 life domains. You can have more than domains. So some examples include, for example, friend, family, your religious part, and work, and different life domains. So work, and then there are different domains. And different domains give you different, like diversification of emotions, so to speak. So instead of looking at conflict, look at motivational basis of why do I go back to family? Why do I go to work? What am I, why am I engaging there? What does it lead? Remember, resources is what we are seeking, right? Seek and protect resources. So maybe different domains are giving us different resources. That is where we are going with that logic, that we go to different life domains for different resources. I mean, you would not go to work and say, I want relationship here. And you would not go to your spouse and say, how much do I get paid today? Right? So different domains give you different resources. So more integrated role balance, motivational basis. that involves looking at different cultural aspects would be the right answer to what we think is a better understanding of work-life balance. In other words, to be fully engaged in your behaviors in different roles, in different life domains, in order to gain the right type of resources that you need to live a good life. Subjective well-being and life satisfaction. So ultimately what we assert is that work non-work balance is driven by motivation to gain and preserve desired resources. So in order to do that, we decided to look at not a conflict trade-off, but more like two-dimensional thing. So on this side is work, on this side is non-work life domains, and engagement in those. On this side, engagement on the work side. So if you look at this line, which means you are engaged in non-work and work, this is what they're really saying is work-life balance. You're balanced in both. Now, if you look at this line, you're still balanced, right? It's just that you're balanced, non-engaged. So the problem with the word balance is that it doesn't show you, it really refers to only this part. It doesn't give you any answer to this side. So any combination of your engagement on this dotted line is balance. It's just that the right answer to balance is when you're engaged in both of them equally, when you have time for both, commitment for both, or whatever. And if you don't, that's where they say conflict is. But what about people who are not at all engaged? Why are they not engaged? Nobody tells us. So the reason we think we need to look at motivational basis is because it answers that. It also doesn't help to understand why people might go on this side where work becomes more important than other parts of life, or why this. Part of this is, I think, analysis becomes two-dimensional. So you need to have surface analysis rather than a linear analysis. So I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I explained that in the diagram. So this is what we did in terms of our study. We got data from World Value Survey, Wave 5, that collected data from 2005 to 2008 from 57 countries with a sample of about 83,000. We only looked at married employed people. So our sample reduced to over 21,000, and only from 53 countries that provided reliable data. We used these items to measure. Work engagement was important scale. Non-work was combination of 5 domains. Again, in terms of engagement, there was a subjective health issue and life satisfaction as the 2 things. So our dependent variables were subjective health and life satisfaction. What we found was that across all respondents, non-work engagement and work engagement were positively correlated, but non-work engagement were more positively related to subjective health and life satisfaction than work engagement. So when we did polynomial analysis, our results show that only non-work engagement, not work engagement, significantly predicted subjective health and life satisfaction. We also found that square term predicted work engagement for subjective health. We found some cultural differences. So broadly, what we found was we used global competitiveness index as a cultural proxy. And what we found was that in rich countries, traditional model worked. But in lower global competitiveness, which is country like, say, India, the model did not hold. So just to show you what I mean by that, I'll come back to this slide. This is the overall result we found, which is the traditional engagement on both sides. You have the highest subjective health. or life satisfaction. But if we look at low GCI, you would notice that these are poorer countries, relatively speaking, that life engagement was more important than work engagement. So if you notice the importance, life importance and subjective health, you will notice that the number was higher here compared to when you are this is when you are combined on both. This point is you're engaged on both, which is slightly lower than this. In other words, if you're only engaged in life, you're getting superior results for your health. What it basically means is that countries that are less concerned about money, relational returns are higher. And as compared to this, you will notice that this is high GCI, which is like US. You will notice that that's where the work-life balance model works. I think in previous session, somebody asked a question like, how do we figure out whether results or the studies in the US, how do we differentiate our results? This is an example of that, where most models in US explain this side, and hardly any research shows why this could be true for low GCI countries, which is completely different than traditional work-life balance model. And that's not just for health. Same effects were found even more so for life satisfaction. Like more relational, other life domains are more important than work. And again, life satisfaction, if you look at traditional model, you would see the balance part is much more interesting. Okay. Any questions here? Or?
So Atul, it means that if you look at low GCI countries, people who give more importance to life, they tend to have better health. Is that
right? Right.
And similarly, in the next, in this slide, in low GCI countries, when people, or for those individuals who are looking at giving more importance to life,
more engaged with life, yeah,
they tend to have better satisfaction, life satisfaction.
Right.
Okay. And in the high GCI countries, the effects are reverse.
The effects are that you need to be engaged in both.
That, okay. That when you are engaged at work as well as life, then your
more happy.
Life satisfaction is high.
Right. Notice if only work, only life is far worse than combined.
Combined. Okay.
This is a traditional model.
Yeah.
Balanced all domains.
Right.
But in low GCI, we do not know why.
Yeah.
All we know is this is the fact. This is the cross-cultural puzzle. We do not know why.
Yeah.
But notice here that here, if only work is really bad, combined is good, but
yeah. So life importance is at 2 and work importance is at -2 there.
Yeah.
There you get the highest life satisfaction score.
Yeah. We do not know the answer to this finding, but what we do know is that there are cultural differences. The traditional model of work-life balance is more true for European countries.
Where they promote or kind of argue for a balance between work and life.
Right. And it could be because our values in these countries focus more on relationship. It could be that we have to take care of parents, and that's where we drive life satisfaction if we are unable to do and so forth. We do not know.
Okay.
We need to figure that out. But what we do know is that the traditional model doesn't work here.
Yeah.
Not as well.
Yeah. This was in the fifth wave of
fifth wave. And there is a seventh wave we can replicate and see if that. Yeah. So if anybody is interested, they can pick up data from seventh wave to see if this holds. But again, maybe more detailed, just specific to this could be a good study, right? So what about resource gap? We need to look at why do people engage in work? We know kind of work gives meaning to people, work gives money to people. We know that. But what about why do people engage in life? What are different things they get from there? Because most of it has been about conflict. We do not know what resources people are getting. It's less clear as to what do people get from, or like I think there's some study that shows how each domain can help other domain. But there's a lot more we need to understand. Why do people go to life and what do they get about it? We need to figure out those who have less resources or are asked to do more at home. I think there is a study in Europe that says that if you could quantify women's work at home in terms of pay. So let's say they spend 5 hours working at home compared to men who work 2 hours there, this European study, and put dollar value to or pound value to it. Their salary is actually higher than men, or about same. Because we don't pay them at home, they get paid. So why is that? How does that impact them? Because they're not getting any money from it. So how does that gap affect their engagement there or their frustrations there or whatever? We need to understand this if we really want to. Don't try to just get rid of equity issues at work. You know, everybody's talking about equity issues at work. What about at home and so forth? That's where we need to look at comprehensively different resources and different domains, not just work domain. Finally, I think we are really not, this hybrid thing is just a brand new thing. All sorts of issues are important there, but work-life balance is definitely something that future work places have to look at. I think in another session, somebody asked, how do we measure performance of people who are working from home? That's just one of many questions that we do not know. But in my mind, I think one of the biggest change that is going to happen, besides not able to see what they're doing other than Zoom, is this boundary that existed for people who work from home. That would not be there. So what exactly we mean by work-life balance when there is a hybrid place? So there's a lot more that is changing rapidly that we need to figure out here. That's, I don't know if I'm a little early or about right time.
Thank you. Thank you. We are open for questions. Any questions from the audience? Yeah. We can pass the mic. Yeah.
Dr. Mitra, you defined two dependent variables, subjective health and life satisfaction.
Speak into the mic.
Yeah.
Louder.
Still not audible?
Huh.
Defined two dependent variables, subjective health and life satisfaction. Revisit the definition.
Yeah, I got it.
And also the fact that, are these the only two dependent variables, or are there more variables that we'll need to, look into, or rather decipher?
But these were the two variables we looked at in terms of this particular study, but these are not the only two. Now, I think I want to make sure you understand we were driven by the data to some extent. We did not collect our own data. And World Value Survey defines life satisfaction as all things considered, how satisfied are you with life?
So this was one item measure.
One item.
One item measure.
So if you really see the problem with the study, these are single item measures.
Okay, so for subjective health also it was one.
Yeah, subjective health, it says, how would you describe your overall state of health?
Okay.
So it's not like a doctor telling us, that's why subjective health. I think subjective well-being or subjective health is the most popular measure on this issue. You could use multiple items. In this case, they use one item. Real health is not the thing that people often ask. Let me say this, I think even pain, when you go to a doctor, it's a subjective measure, right? So it's not like medicine doesn't ask for subjective. You know, they give you faces and all, that doesn't make it more objective. Yeah, that's a shortcoming, if you were to ask me.
Also, the ways in which questions are being approached. Yeah. These questions are there. They can be further itemized there.
Could be. So they are going to 57 countries and asking local people this question in their language. So they have to be simpler questions so that there is no translation issue. And these are questions that are asked verbally. So people go and actually, so they interview people and ask questions so that there is no doubt in terms of answer. So they have to keep these items as such. I mean, I do not know all the parameters of the study, but there are about 80,000, 90,000 people in so many different languages. I think they are trying to make sure the data is comparable and all that. So the scope of study makes them do this. Good question.
So there is a, before we go to the next question from the audience, I'd like to take up a question, Atul, which is by Praharshita. And she says, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's work on noise, recent work on noise suggests that noise can play a big role in affecting expectations and judgments. The measurement of performance being dependent on many variables, variable factors and lack of compliance, interpersonal ties between manager and employee could have more sway over the pay, which introduces noise. Is there any research looking into how noise affects pay for performance decisions and how employees feel about these criteria, such as the level of transparency of these criteria, etc.? Yeah. So the political dynamics between a manager and an employee, which is a noise that can get into your pay for performance decisions.
Right. Good question. I think I think anybody who looks at communication would tell you that communication is a very difficult thing. Creating a brand means simple message. And that's also true for pay for performance. Pay for performance can only work if the message is clear. If you combine anything else, a relationship and all that, then pay for performance system is not pay for performance system. So then whatever it is, it is. So I think that's why the idea of control, if you look at it, control was, do I have control over factors about line of sight? So the language regarding whether you see a connection between pay and performance is called line of sight. So to the person who asked that question, political influences, relationships, or even combining constructive feedback with pay for performance will dilute line of sight and lack of control. And when there is lack of control, then you have that problem where they do not know if it is for their behavior or for something else. And if it's not for their performance, then they get more, they say, well, I'm lucky, if less. So in a way, we answered that question through the measure of control over things. But bottom line is pay for performance system failed because of poor communication.
Communication between manager and the employee.
Right, or about the system. I think the only way things can work is if people know they got what they got for what they did. And if you mix 2 or 3 or 4 more behaviors, then they do not know why they got it. And that's true for reinforcement theory too, right? So for example, when children are rewarded or punished, and if you don't precisely define why, you will find alternative behaviors because you did not reinforce the right behavior. So for example, when a child hits a good shot in cricket and you say, great job, they do not know why. So they might see great job because they ran or because they did not hit, or they do not know what great job really means because there is a lack of communication there. So they might do what was not intended because the connection between behavior and reward does not exist. So anytime there is a noise or whatever, I mean, the Gerhardt, again, to answer, add more to information that she just said. So Gerhardt was the previous dean at Wisconsin. He is a famous research in incentives. And they wrote a chapter, they asked people, how much do you expect? And expectation was somewhere between 15 to 13% raise.
30.
30.
15 to 30%. Okay.
In America, where generally raises happen to between 2 to 5%. How can that be? Poor communication. Poor communication. People, you really have to tell them what it is. Otherwise, you are going to fail the system. Then you say system doesn't work. It's the managers who make them fail it.
But there's also a problem of perceptions on the side of followers, right?
Sure.
So for managers, yes, we can say the implication is there needs to be clearly defined criteria and you need to communicate them well. But then for followers or for subordinates, there's also a perception, like you said, 15 to 30%.
Yeah.
What can managers do what could leaders do to kind of manage that?
I think she answered that to some extent. I think transparency is very important. I think most of us, I do not know about India, but in America, most of us attribute success to themselves and failures to others.
Yeah, attribution,
right? So when you ask them, so the question was asked to employees, how many of you are above average in America? 85% people said they are above average. That means 35% people were lying. And when you asked the manager, it was like 49%. So managers thought only 49% were above average. They were closer to the right answer. But 85% people said they are better than average. So that creates some false expectations to correct. But again, you have to be just objective, honest, and that's not easy. And pay is a very touchy subject.
Yeah.
But people are very sensitive to money. So the broad answer is it's not an easy thing. With the best intentions, you could still fail. Good question, very good question.
Questions from the audience? So there's another question, interesting question by Professor T.V. Rao. And it says, by creating extrinsic incentives for work and better work or more work, we created a feeling that work is different than life. This is contribution of pay for performance. Is this contribution of pay for performance? For example, Indian professors do research nowadays for incentives. For example, you have 10 lakh rupees for a A-star publication. Quite unlike in the past where we did research because we enjoyed. So the
Intrinsic, extrinsic.
The dilemma of self-determination and the intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, and what does money do to that?
I think one of the things about intrinsic motivation is they say that if you take away money, they would feel punished and they would still not write. That's why erosion of intrinsic motivation.
So the cognitive evaluation theory says
Yeah.
if you actually start paying for things that people enjoy it, they may actually withdraw from doing
Right,
that.
right.
So
That's the
I think
erosion.
that's the underlying argument that the
For-
intrinsic theorists talk about when
Yeah,
they talk
DC
about
and all these people talk about it, right? I do not know how to prove this. So what they do is they have intrinsic work, then they tie money to it, and then they withdraw money and people still don't do it. So they say, well, see, they were doing it before, now they are not doing it. Right? That's why they see erosion. But there is no easy way to reverse the process where you have money, add intrinsic to it, then withdraw intrinsic. What happens to money? There is no easy way to create an experiment opposite to it. So there is no way to falsify the claim. The only way I think I can say this is that would a professor, how many of us would have said, I enjoy doing it, 10,000, 10 lakh, why not? How many of us would say, no, I'm enjoying it, keep your money? I don't think a single professor would say, I'm having fun, I don't need money. I don't think anybody would say it. So I think we are falsely in love with this intrinsic notion. Why not have both? I just don't get it.
Yeah, so the argument there is the erosion of intrinsic motivation, and very interestingly, Desai and Ryan, when they now 2017, they have revised their self-determination theory model, the recent ones where they actually say there are different shades of extrinsic motivation as well.
Right.
And not all shades of extrinsic motivation are counter to performance. And they talk about the integrated extrinsic motivation, which is like intrinsic motivation, and money can also drive that kind of.
See, the theory has been pushed towards the extrinsic motivation.
So they have now accepted that it's not just clear intrinsic, extrinsic, even extrinsic can have different shades, and few shades are similar to intrinsic. And so the challenge is.
Here is my question to, again, I know you are interested in intrinsic motivation, so let me ask you this question. How do we measure intrinsic motivation? We know money. So everybody can bash it. How do we know it is intrinsically motivating?
So I think the measure, it's a self-report because it's an attitude. It's a individual's own perception, and that is how they get into it. Where you have those self-reported items.
Right. It's an agency, and since you are saying this interesting, it is
what
interesting.
makes me do this particular?
Yeah. I mean, I get it. I understand. But some of the most, so I have not seen, so music is a very intrinsically motivating thing. But I have seen most tuitions being offered by people who, why? Why not free? I mean, I think real world, there are 50,000, about 52,000 actors in America.
50,000.
52,000 actors, TV and whatever. If you just add the compensation of top 20 actors and top 10 actors and top 10 actresses, they make more money than rest of the 50,000 people. And rest of the 50,000 are struggling to get some money. Most intrinsic work out there, creativity wise, they all want money. I mean, that's the reality out there. I mean, I think DC and I think they need to go study them.
No, in a way they accept it when they revise the
Yeah.
yeah. Any questions? So there are some more questions. So Ashutosh writes, is there a conflict in performance-based incentive and ethical ways of working? Ethical. So can you be ethical when you are working on performance-based? So is there anything that you
Good question. Ashutosh, I think it's a good question. So I think there is an interesting article on folly of rewarding A, hoping for B or something like that. I think problem is that people do, it's a powerful tool. So people would behave the way you reward them.
reward them?
Could that lead to unethical behavior, say for salespeople? Sure, it can. But the problem, I think, is not. So I have not, that's a good question. I have not thought about it. But my gut tells me that it's more likely to have ethical issues when you reward results as compared to performance. So if you base, I think most people in pay for performance would say performance should be a behavior-based index because that's in control of employees. But if you tie it to say output or result, then it will lead to more unethical issues. That's what I would think. But I could be wrong. But
So results versus process.
Results
so-
versus behaviors.
Yeah.
So the way to look at this is like, let's say I'm a salesperson, I'm selling a car, and you are the customer. You come to me, and I convince you of buying the car. You are really convinced. So whatever I did should be the right answer, my behaviors. And then you call your spouse saying, I really like this car. I think it's a good deal. I found this honest guy. And your wife says, did you look at your bank balance? We cannot afford it. And you don't buy it. So result is not in control of behavior because somebody's spouse has said no, or other contextual factors. So what happens is then salespeople tend to behave in certain ways. A good example, I think, is in medical profession. When you are getting paid by the result, number of patients you see, you engage in different behaviors. So Mayo Clinic doctors are paid by salary. Mayo Clinic in US is one of the most known healthcare provider. And whenever you go there, they give you an hour, whatever time is allocated to each patient. They don't hurry you because they're getting paid by salary. And if it takes more time, they give you more time. That's the right thing because that's the behavior. It's a salaried doctor. They get paid enough.
Yeah.
But if you go to any other doctor, you have to wait for 40 minutes and you might not get 10 minutes because it's based on results, number of patients seen. My gut tells me that unethical behavior is more likely when you're looking for results.
Mhm.
But sometimes you don't have an option.
Yeah. Yeah. So any questions? Yeah.
Professor, in your research, you showed that low GCI countries are not putting that much importance on work. So is it possible that if the working conditions itself improved in those countries, then they may start giving more importance to work?
I don't think that's what the results were showing. They were showing that even when you put as importance to work as to life, you are more happy when you pay more attention just to life. In other words, it's not the work that is causing the problem. It's not the work that is causing the problem. Engagement to work is still okay. But somehow there are more resources or relational resources that are valuable in low GCI countries. We don't know the answer to why the results were, but chances are that there is higher value placed to relational issues in low GCI countries. I think a lot of people tell me in India, for example, that taking care of your family is important. So values are different, family is more important, and so forth. I think there is some research that tells us that Asian countries have integrated self as compared to independent self.
Self-construct, yeah. Independent and dependent.
Yeah, or integrated or dependent self. So I think we include more people when we define ourselves, and maybe that's why what we see. I do not know, but it's not problem with the work. That's what I'm trying to answer you.
Yeah.
Any other
So
questions?
there's one more question by Professor Murthy, Alice Murthy, and he says, we can create uniform and engaging environments at workplace, but with people currently with diversified family backgrounds and not many adequate support systems, life and work priorities are much more complicated.
Yeah.
Balancing is still a huge challenge. Is there any way we could help create best practices?
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question yet.
Okay, so I think he's saying for a workforce which is diversified and there may not be many. So you may have different people with different expectations and
At work.
Life as well as work priorities. What could organizations do to create the right balance?
At work.
At work, yeah.
If I get the gist of the question, I think what he might be referring to is, can you create certain resources at workplace?
Yeah,
that are more relational than money, and that may not be easy because of diversified workplace. I do not know. I think some of the answers could be found in social network issues, where you gain more resources through being connected to more people, more links and to your nodes. So I think the best practice would be to give you opportunity to connect to people, and then individuals seek linkages. Are you familiar with the social network theory? Are you familiar? Okay, so I think social network theory is kind of an answer to networking part. So it basically says that there are two types of people, nodes and bridges. Nodes are like everybody's connected to this central node. Everybody's connected. And then bridges who connects two networks. And it seems that bridges tend to be far more successful in life than central nodes. But irrespective, these important roles create more social capital and more social power. So the policy could be to, and those who are not connected are isolated or called isolates and are likely to leave. And I think probably the question that can be answered could be using that logic, where we make sure that people are not isolates and they have sufficient connections within the social network. Part of it is on the individual, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
Good question.
So I think there are two questions integrated. One by Ashutosh again, where he's asking, is work-life integration a better term, more appropriate term than work-life balance in today's world? And Shubhangi, she's talking about integrating social support, which you just alluded to, from the supervisors and co-workers into the whole.
My bias is to say work-life balance is not a good term.
It's not a good term.
I don't think so.
Hmm.
I think you can say integration or a profile or whatever term, but this whole notion of somehow people can balance or should balance is probably not right. As an example, when you are young, you are more likely to be engaged at work because you need that resource, money. You don't have money unless you're rich. You don't have that money. So where do you engage? You go to work at the cost of. So are you unhappy? Probably not, because that's what you need to protect your time in future. Once you accumulate wealth, you might move to different domains. So at different stages of life, you might have different answers to work-life engagement. So I don't think balance is the right answer. I think it became popular because of gender issue. Because women were unable to balance it and men were okay to be at work. That's the social role they played. But I think people ignored the fact that women in any case experienced gender resource gap, no matter what you do. So it kind of sells them short, the term, because they are not only living a much more demand from home and work, but also not paying attention to what they do not have. I think I was traveling from Delhi to Jaipur, and they were like, the most common message on the vehicle was "Ladki padhao, ladki bachao" or something like that. That was like everywhere. I mean, that clearly shows there is a gap and somebody's trying to deal with it, like education gap or self-esteem gap and so forth. I think those issues are more important in helping create a balance in life for women than the simple notion of work-life balance, in my mind. I think focus on gender resource gap is first step before we can go to work-life balance issue.
So in your experience, why Megha has asked a question, what is the problem? Why organizations are not doing enough to reduce or bridge this gap, the gender resource gap that you talk about?
Yeah.
She even alludes to a point that why do we not hire people who are above 40 years, even for entry-level jobs, if they are interested? We just do not do enough to get women back to work.
Yeah. Easy answer would be our social fabric doesn't allow. But I do not know for sure. I think somehow subconsciously societies do what they do. It's just in the system. I think one of my economics professors said it cannot exist because a smart businessman would only hire women. And market would have taken care of it. So as an economist, he just could not believe there is a gap in pay. Because let's say there is a 15% gap and I'm the businessman or woman, I would only hire women because I got 15% discount on salary. And I would beat every competitor out. And then there would be no gap. Otherwise, the others would start doing the same thing. They have to raise the salary. It's like supply and demand issue. But it still persists. Despite my professor's illusion about it, every research shows there is a problem. And that's just pay, which is very objective. I mean, there are all sorts of, like training, like designing of clothes or training of Google Voice is done by male. And so forth. And that's just, I'm just saying gender resource gap. I think if you're a lefty, you've experienced all sorts of gaps too. Is there anybody here lefty? All folders are designed for right people. Right, I mean, life is tough for a lefty in a way.
There was a research quite a few years ago which said when the society was not so developed, which showed that left-handers had a lower life expectancy than right-handers because the world was designed for right-handers.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's true, even though I think lefties are best cricketers. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I think
Thank you.
So let's have a just close the. So thank you, Professor Mitra, for wonderful, a long session, and
Thank you.
it was very interesting to know about your research and important topics. I really like those 6 facts that you have summarized on the financial and the incentives research. Also, some really interesting thoughts on work-life balance, non-work balance, and how do we integrate resources into that. So take a photo. As a small gesture from the center's
Thank you.
side, we would like to maybe this. Beach mein aa jao. So as a token from the center. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's join us for tea outside. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And I hope everybody was okay for me going against intrinsic motivation.
Yeah. And
I was just trying to make my point.
yes.
I believe in intrinsic motivation research too. So.
Yeah. And thank you everybody for people who have joined us over Zoom also. Thank you very much for your participation.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.